Horowitz, and I'd like to start with something completely and totally irrelevant. In 2002, a young man named Andre McCollins was institutionalized in a school called the Judge Rodenberg Educational Center, otherwise known as the JRC. McCollins had autism and was severely intellectually disabled. He had spent his entire life going from institution to institution to institution, where he was heavily medicated and subject to sexual abuse. The JRC was appealing to his parents because they promised that they were not going to heavily medicate him, that he was going to be able to live his own life. They promised that they would normalize his behavior, and more importantly, they wouldn't turn down a patient, no matter how violent, no matter how difficult the case. Instead of heavy medication, what they would do is a practice known as physical aversives. Basically, if someone exhibited a violent behavior, they would institute electric shocks or other kinds of punishments, but electric shocks most well known. They assured the public that this would only be used in cases where the students are being violent. In 2002, Mr. McCollins refused to take off his coat at the direction of a staff member, and as a result, was tied down and issued 31 electric shocks. Now, the one I'm about to show you is extremely distressing.
Dramatic video.
Now, the reason I want to show you this, and the reason I think it's important, is because it's totally irrelevant to what I'm about to say. This institution still exists. Andre's okay now, but the institution still exists, it still tortures its students, and it does so on taxpayer money. You can't find this in my thesis, not in the introduction, not in the conclusion, not in the body paragraphs, not in the footnotes, not in the bibliography, not in the appendix. And it's because my thesis is about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm going to be talking about what an amazing success it was, how instrumental it was, how revolutionary it was, how much it jolted forward the movement for the liberation of disabled people. But I want everyone here to understand that even if the ADA was everything we wanted it to be, it would not have protected the Andre McCollins of this world. And there's still more to be done. And with that said, I'm here to present my thesis, which is titled Loud Promises, Silent Compromises: The Conservative Movement, President George Bush, and the Campaign to Pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's begin with a simple question. What is the Americans with Disabilities Act? I imagine most of you know what it is. In case some of you don't, it's simply a law that said that you can't discriminate on the basis of disability. Now, there had already been similar laws in the books prior to that, but most of them only applied to government agencies or to education. So, for example, the Voting Rights Act of 1964, among many other things, ensured that disabled people had the same right to vote as everyone else. Other laws that ensure that governments cannot work with government agencies can't discriminate against disabled people for the basis of employment or receiving welfare. They can't work with contractors who discriminate against disabled people. But private businesses absolutely could. So if you tried to go to a store and there wasn't a ramp and you're paraplegic, there's no legal recourse before 1990. However, if you go to a store and they kick you out because they don't think that you can buy anything, there was no legal recourse. I had Justin Daw, one of the founders of this movement, a man known as the godfather of the ADA, wasn't even given his teaching certificate because he was disabled. And that was totally legal at the time. So let's begin with the thesis of my thesis, probably the place to start, which is in the 1980s, a conservative disability rights ideology developed that balanced valuing the basic human dignity of each person and issues of economic liberty. The people who subscribed to this idea were largely responsible, or at least partly responsible, for passing the ADA. But their commitment to other conservative principles ultimately resulted in compromises that limited its effectiveness. I want to begin the story with a man named Justin Dodd. Justin Dodd was, as I mentioned earlier, considered the father of the ADA, or the godfather of the ADA. I had the privilege of being able to interview his widow, Yoshiko Dodd, for this paper. We communicated via a series of email correspondences. She gave me answers to a lot of my questions, and she pointed me in a direction of a lot of my sources. So even sources that are not necessarily just things that Yoshiko told me, a lot of them are sources that she pointed me towards. Now, Justin Dodd's career began in college, not as a disability rights activist, but as an advocate for civil rights, and specifically an anti-segregation activist. He started an integration club at his school. Only 5 people came to the meetings, one of which was Justin Dodd, one of which was his then wife. 3 of them were disabled. As Yoshiko Dodd told me at the time, they didn't view themselves as being people just needing civil rights. Justin Dodd was heavily influenced by the civil rights movement. He would reference it throughout his life. A mere 3 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, he spoke at the 30th anniversary of the March of Washington and thanked Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and a variety of civil rights activists very active in the 1960s for their role in disability liberation. Justin Dodd also, interestingly enough, was a Republican. Now, not for the entirety of his life. In the earliest, when he flipped between parties quite frequently. In the early part of his life, he was a Democrat, and according to an interview he gave, he became a Republican later in life because he opposed the paternalism of government. He was fiscally conservative. He didn't like the idea of this big government and feeling that they had control over it. And then by 1996, he was a Democrat again. But the important section to consider is the 1970s and 80s, when he was very active in the Reagan and Bush administrations. His family was quite close with the Reagans. They were family friends. He knew Ronald Reagan. He worked in various positions in the administration, not only in the context of as a disability rights advocate, but also he worked in his rehabilitation section of the Education Department, a position that he was fired from in 1987 when he spoke out against their practices before the United States Congress. Now, Dodd wasn't the only activist around this time, but something to understand about a lot how activism was moving in the 1980s was you started to see a development of this idea of trying to work in government. It's not to say that there weren't like big, angry, classic, like we're going to have a demonstration activists. Around the time of the ADA was the Capitol Crawl, a wonderful piece of activism where disabled people crawled up the steps of the Capitol on their hands and knees. And there were organizations such as ADAPT, for example, which you might know as one of the big protesters against the Obamacare repeal. They're most well known for chaining themselves to bus lines that are not accessible and getting themselves arrested. Those organizations exist, but a lot of those advocates ended up becoming in charge of enforcing regulations that not just from the ADA, but from bills prior to that. And you start to see a government class of disability rights advocates. People like Justin Dodd, people like C. Boyden Gray, people who, not only in the federal government, but you start to see it in different states. So for example, Jerry Brown was very big on appointing disabled people into positions in government agencies that were oftentimes not very nice to disabled people. So you start to see that emergence. Also emerging in the 1980s is a new disability rights ideology, a conservative vision of disability rights. You first really start to see that in the 1970s, was actually, surprisingly enough, Richard Nixon. So he had this event known as National Employer Handicap Week. I might be butchering the name, but that's essentially what it's called. It was started by Harry Truman, and every year the president would give an address. But what you saw during the Nixon administration was this adoption of an idea that disabled people are more disadvantaged because of societal attitudes about the disability rather than the disability itself. That starts to really come to emergency. He even said as such. Now, he did not put this in human rights terms. A lot of this was economic and a lot of this was patriotic. You hire a disabled person, you're helping America, you're helping the economy, this is better for everyone. And I'm not going to claim as well that Nixon was some great philosopher of disability rights, but it was a development. When you really start seeing progress in the Republican Party is in the 1980s, firstly in the Reagan administration. It was activists in the Reagan administration who worked in his own government agencies that first suggested the idea, not first, but that started really pushing for the idea of an ADA. Originally as an add-on to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and later as its own separate piece of legislation. In 1984, the first time we really see disability rights take a central role, a really prominent role in the party platform. In 1988, the Republican Party platform all but called for disability, for the passage of an ADA, and celebrated a variety of very big economic achievements that disabled people made under the Reagan administration. Now, it wasn't because of this. It wasn't entirely just because of the Republicans that the ADA passed. I want to acknowledge that before I go forward. There were a lot of Democrats involved, and there were also a lot of activists involved who weren't in government. A lot of people were pushing for the ADA. Ted Kennedy and Tom Hawken opposed the ADA. It was their brainchild. They were the ones who were pushing it through the Senate. But it's also important to acknowledge that without Republican support, it very likely wouldn't have passed. The Republicans didn't have control of Congress at this time, but they definitely could have held it back. And if the Bush administration had vetoed it, then it very likely couldn't have overcome that veto. So they were very instrumental in getting this bill through Congress. But it's also important to understand that they also really limited the bill's effectiveness. So one thing you saw in the Reagan administration, we definitely see in the Bush administration around this time, is conservative disability rights ideology conflicting with bread and butter Republican values, specifically support for small businesses. Very few small businesses and corporations really could come out and say, we oppose the ADA outright, we want to reject it. You actually don't, I didn't see a lot of evidence of a lot of people doing that. They're not going to say there weren't those who did. I mean, Reason Magazine around this time put out a very, very negative article about the Americans with Disabilities Act. But for the most part, businesses try to take this stance of, well, we're not going to say we oppose it, we don't want it to not pass, we're just concerned. The concern is basically being that they don't want people to, they don't want to be bogged down in excessive lawsuits based on unintentional discrimination. And there's this portrayal of themselves as really being helpful in trying their best to help disabled people. Now, again, they couldn't really prevent it from passing. At this point, it was too popular, but they did bog it down. One of the ways they did that is originally they tied the bill to the Civil Rights Act. The reason they wanted to do that is because they did not want disabled people suing for damages. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and based on subsequent Supreme Court decisions, you could sue to stop discrimination under the Civil Rights Act, but you couldn't sue for damages, which is how it works with the ADA today. So let's say I, as an autistic person, am kicked out of a restaurant because I'm autistic. I could sue to stop the discrimination, but I couldn't get rich off the Civil Rights Act. I'm not going to make millions and millions of dollars off of it. So originally they were tied because the Republicans said, listen, we don't want disabled people having more rights than other groups. But then something changed. There was a big, big movement to allow people to sue for damages under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and in 1990 they passed a revised Civil Rights Act that allowed people to do that. At this point, the Bush administration gets nervous, and the Attorney General indicates to Steny Hoyer, who was the person who proposed the bill in the House, that if the ADA isn't de-linked to the Civil Rights Act, that the bill won't be allowed to pass at all. That they'll veto it, that they'll withdraw support. Publicly, they're saying that's not true. Publicly, this spokesperson of one of the White House spokespeople are saying, no, we fully support the ADA, we're always going to support it, but they're telling Congress people in Congress, if this doesn't change, then we can't continue to support this legislation. And it did change. They de-linked the bills. That's why you can sue for damages under the Civil Rights Act, but you can't sue for damages under the ADA. So if I'm discriminated against for being Jewish, I can sue for a lot of money. That is a disincentive to discriminate, because you're going to have to face a man-to-lead court battle. You could lose everything. But if I'm discriminated against for being disabled, I don't have those same kind of protections. So it assorted this idea that disability is less valuable, it doesn't matter as much as other areas of need protection. And this hurt the Republican Party in trying to defend it later on after the Bush administration. So I want to add just a brief statement of where we are now. The ADA still exists as it is, but time hasn't always been so kind to it. It's now become a partisan issue, which it wasn't when it was passed. A few years back, the ADA Education Reform Act was passed in the House of Representatives. It was not passed in the Senate, and it seems now it probably won't be passed anytime soon. But the bill would have required a waiting period before suing under the ADA. So it would have required 60 days to give notice to the business, and they would have 120 days to respond and fix the issue. This would have further limited it, and would have been a big problem for disabled people who need justice now. If I need access to a restaurant or a hotel, I don't need that in 120 days, I need that as soon as possible. And a lot of this is because there's been a great deal of concern over drive-by lawsuits, this idea that people are getting rich off the ADA, which, as we mentioned, is not true. As for the activists, there's a new generation of activists going forward. Justin Dodd passed away in 2001, in 2002, or 102. And a new generation of people who are rising forward to take on this mantle. And right now, a lot of this activism is based on defending the ADA, because there's a lot of attacks on it. But I want everyone to remember what we talked about in the beginning, which is that the ADA is a wonderful piece of legislation. It is, in fact, probably at the time, the most progressive legislation on disability rights in the world. And it protected a lot of people. But if you remember what I said about Andre McCollins, it doesn't protect everyone. Thank you.